The public has a long-held fascination with detectives. Detectives see a side of life the average person is never exposed to. In this podcast series, I Catch Killers with Gary Jubilant, I'll be interviewing a whole range of people you come across as a detective, including police, bad guys and victims. I spent 34 years as a cop. For 25 of those years I was catching killers. That's what I did for a living. I was a homicide detective. I'm no longer just interviewing bad guys. Instead, I'm taking the public into the world in which I operated. The guests I selected have amazing stories from all sides of the law. The interviews are raw and honest, just like the world they inhabited. No one who steps into the world of crime comes out unchanged. Join me now while I take you into this world. This episode of I Catch Killers contains conversations that some listeners may find confronting or triggering. Discretion is advised. Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. If you want to get into the mindset of people who kill and the tools that detectives use to catch killers, you're in for a real treat today. Today's guest is internationally renowned for her work across several areas of research related to both forensic anthropology and criminology. If that's not enough to keep someone busy, our guest is also the author of 3 books, Mothers Who Murder, Reasonable Doubt and Cold Case. She has also worked extensively in television on shows including BBC's History Cold Case, Channel 10's Wanted series, and Murder, Lies and Alibis on Channel 9. Currently, she is the Senior Lecturer and Convener of Criminology at the University of Newcastle. The guest will give us an extraordinary insight into the world of crime. Dr. Xanthe Mallett, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
That's quite an introduction, yeah. I've got to step up now.
It is an introduction. Yeah. It is an introduction, and we've got so much to talk about, I really don't know where to start. Normally, I'd how you got into this, but let's first of all explore what these qualifications are all about, because my understanding of criminology and forensic anthropology, they're not exactly the same type of sciences.
No, they're actually completely different. So my background is in hard science, so biology, basically. I started with an undergraduate degree in archaeological science, and I focused on all of the courses that looked at human remains, evolution. So it was always about the bones for me. I then did masters in biological anthropology. So again, bones, I looked at the head and face and how they adapt to extreme environment, hot and cold, on a population level. And at PhD, I did facial recognition. So all within that kind of hard science area, whereas criminology is a social science, so it's behavioural based.
So having those two different spheres of science to approach what you're looking at, do you find that complements each other?
Yeah, people think it's odd, because you generally do either the hard science.
That's why I've asked the question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I thought that. Yeah. Or the social science. Yeah. But to me, the two parts are the same thing. So to understand a crime scene and how the evidence presents the way it does, you need to understand how people interacted with it. So to me, they're literally two sides of a puzzle, whereas other people tend to focus on one or the other. So I like to think it's a strength. Yeah. I'll leave everyone else to decide whether I've kind of crossed a boundary.
Well, I suppose it creates that environment of checks and balances for you, a hard science and a social science. So to combine the two. Yeah. With your anthropology, how would that be used in the world of crime?
So normally, it used to be historically be where human remains were found where they were skeletonized. So you may have remains that are found, months or even years after somebody has died, and you need somebody who can recognise all of those skeletal elements to make sure that they're recovered, and also that you can get a biological profile from those, so their age, their stature, whether they were male or female, and some information about ancestry. And so you can use an anthropologist to get that kind of information to help you identify those remains.
And putting that into an environment that I understand from as a homicide detective, if we found human remains, quite often we're not sure if they're historical human remains, and sometimes they're fresh. But that's the type of thing that you're looking at, how to put a date, age, sex even?
Yeah, and even stepping back from that, a lot of the times it's not necessarily obvious if they're human or animal. And you may think that it would be, but if remains are fragmented, for example, or if a pig can in some ways look like a human. So the ribs are about the same size and about the same shape because they're doing a similar job in a similar size animal. So you can get animals that can look like a human to those who aren't good at, aren't trained at telling the difference.
Well, and I know in the numerous or countless times that I've been searching for human remains during the course of my work, that invariably, and in fact, I don't think there's a time when we haven't found animal bones.
Yes.
And we've got to, when we find the animal bone, we've set it up as a crime scene until it can be determined that it's not human.
And you'd be amazed at how often animal bones can look human. I remember a case when I was in Scotland where seal flipper washed up on the beach, and there was like a whole freak out because a lot of the soft tissue had gone. So the skeletal elements were left with some interconnective tissue, and it looked like a human hand because it's doing, again, a similar job and it has a similar evolution. But obviously we all go, no, that's all right, that's a seal.
Yeah, well, it can steer it if you're investigating the murder of a seal.
Well, and that could be a crime, but in this case,
yes.
I don't think they were too worried.
Okay, so that's the hard science. And the criminology, at what stage did you get into that side of...
So when I was at Dundee, we were doing a lot of child...
And this is Dundee in
Scotland. Yeah, I worked at a forensic centre and we were doing a lot of work around child sexual abuse.
Right.
So mostly from images, alleged abuse. So when somebody gets a virus on their computer, which happens quite a lot when they've been on some dodgy websites, and when their computer goes in to be fixed, then images are discovered. They save them on the hard drive. They save them on and also on mobile phones. So, and the question was, does the person who is holding these images, are they the person perpetrating the abuse in the photos, or are they holding or distributing them? Because obviously the charges are very different. So they needed people who were trained in anatomy to do a comparison between the image and the suspect to determine if they could be ruled in or ruled out as the actual perpetrator of the abuse. Right.
So when you've seen, and breaking it down, if you've seen a child being sexually interfered with, and there's a person that might, an adult person that mightn't be identifiable by face or whatever, it's an appendage or one part of the body.
Often the hands, are shown in the images.
And that is how you track them down.
Yeah, well, you can either rule them in or rule them out, which obviously is important. So we may be able to say, well, it's definitively not the person holding the images, or there are enough points in similarity that it could be that person. You couldn't identify them solely on that basis, but you could certainly give the information, intelligence to the police.
And it could potentially eliminate...
Yes, and I've been involved in cases where we have eliminated individuals in those situations.
I saw in your CV that you specialised in that, in that area, or that was one of your areas of specialty. And did it result in identifying people? Yeah,
we certainly got a number of convictions. People sometimes changed their plea so that they were pleading innocent, and then they saw the report. And one offender was particularly highly freckled, had red hair. When he saw the report, he was like, it does look like me, doesn't it? And the officer said, is it? And he went, yeah. So that was actually the first case that we did.
Right.
And it transpired later that he had a history going back about 20 years, and he was travelling internationally, sex tourism, and he'd been offending here as well as internationally. So that was a good day that when he changed his plea.
And did you find that you get some satisfaction from that, getting that contributed to bringing someone unstuck?
For sure, and the police originally thought that he'd only been perpetrating abuse for about 5 years, going internationally to access children. And then because it was solved in quite an unusual way, this was early on in that research, it was actually covered in a television programme, and a couple of people came forward and said he'd been offending against them as scouts. And so he was then charged for those historical offences. So he never would have been charged without that particular use of technology.
I hear that quite often with child sexual assaults, that when it does hit the media and someone's been identified, the amount of victims that come out and say that they're also victims, and it just makes you wonder how much goes undetected until it is exposed.
Yeah, and I think those two guys had never told anybody. They were just sitting there watching this TV programme and confessed to their partners and then gave evidence to the police, and then they tracked that back for the historical conviction.
Is that where you thought your studies would take you? Into the forensic side of it?
No, not really. No, I didn't think I'd be studying that.
So when you sat down and, okay, this is what I want to do, what was your history in history or?
Well, what did I want to do? I just wanted to do something where I help people, really. So I started in archaeology, but I knew that I wanted to apply my skills in a field that I could help people in a contemporaneous way. So when those cases started coming forward for the alleged child sexual abuse, and I say alleged because some of the people, were not in those images, and that's just as important to make sure that the wrong people aren't going to prison, for cases, so giving that information is just as important. But no, I didn't see my kind of life going that way. But it's always these things come up, don't they? Yeah, and you go down these paths that you never could have foreseen.
And so you drifted into that field because of your expertise that could be utilised in an investigation. And
exactly, yeah. And I just wanted to continue working, on cases where you could assist the police or defence, whoever it happens to be. And kind of diversified from there, really.
And that was all initially over in Scotland?
That's where I got interested in the criminological side of it, because a lot of these networks are online, these child sex offender networks, and I became interested in how these guys, mostly guys, are connecting, because they've got what signals are they giving out online to groom these kids or to make these connections, because obviously it's got to be all covert because it's highly illegal. So that's when I started to become interested in the behavioural science side as well.
Right. And so where did that take you, looking at the behavioural side of things?
Well, so I started looking at patterns of behaviour of child sex offenders, so males versus females. And we all think, people still think, the kind of stranger danger thing, which is actually mythical. Most children are actually offended against by somebody they know, often somebody within a tight family circle or a friend circle, or it could be a teacher at school or a scoutmaster. But generally, it's not the stranger. So just carried on looking at those kind of research paths to figure out who these offenders are, the demographics, so that we can hopefully identify more of them. It's
interesting that you say that, because the thing that we promote to children is stranger danger, and it's going to be Mr. Boogeyman or someone.
And they're going to have horns and a tail, and he's identifiable. Yeah.
And do you think, in your experience with it, that's why people have got away with it for so long?
Yeah, and I think especially with sexual abuse, we know that a lot of it isn't reported. Children don't report for all sorts of reasons for often years or even ever. And even adults. So there's that stigma, and I think the more we talk about it and we break down those stigmas, the more people will report. And we've seen that recently, obviously, with the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Seen some major advances there in, victims being supported in those kind of submissions, and being believed. And that's really important.
Right. So starting off with archaeology, then you drifted into the forensic side of things through your skill set with that, then criminology. Did you make a conscious decision that exploring the ins and outs of crime was what you wanted to do?
Yeah, in 2012, when I moved to Australia, I actually applied for criminology positions rather than forensic science positions. Right. So whilst I still taught forensic science and still research within forensic science, I moved more into the behavioural side then. That was very much a conscious choice. So I can kind of do both now. I'm lucky that I can kind of marry both up. But I wanted to work more in the behavioural science side of things.
And what do you find so interesting about behavioural science?
It's the extremes, I think, of what people will do to each other. You always think you've seen everything, and I'm sure you've seen that in your job, and then somebody will do something, you go, oh, that surprised me.
That's taking a little bit further.
Yeah, it's like, oh, didn't expect that, and why would they do that? And, why was a particular victim selected under those circumstances? So understanding those interactions between people I find really interesting, and obviously crime is the real extension of that.
Is there something that you've got into that exploring a field or an area or a particular type of crime that what the perception of the public is not necessarily what would occur?
Well, I think probably with the most recent book, looking at reasonable doubt and miscarriages of justice, most people think that the criminal justice system gets it right. If somebody is accused of a crime, they're probably guilty of that crime, and there aren't that many innocent people in prison. And actually what I found is, well, that's probably generally true, but there are a number of people in prison who are genuinely wrongfully convicted, and there are patterns of why that happens. And so I think really the public maybe don't have a clear idea of why it goes wrong and why we have those systemic issues and who are vulnerable to that particularly.
Right. With the justice system, like there's this perception that the justice system couldn't possibly get it wrong, but not always the case.
No, absolutely not. And some people are more vulnerable than others to when it goes wrong, and they have less resources to fight it. They don't necessarily know what their rights are, and therefore languishing in prison without a champion really to fight their cause, and therefore, they go undetected. And that worries me, that these individuals are in prison and they have no recourse.
And some of the cases that you've looked at, and I know with your book Cold Case, there was one that, not one, they're all quite interesting. Is there one that sticks in your mind? Or
Oh, in the cold case book. So which one did we say we were going to talk about?
There's one, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit later, which
Okay.
is the Mr. Cruel.
Yes, okay.
Because I find that it's a horrific crime, and the fact that it's still undetected and we don't know, but interpretations of that. But with the work that you're doing, is there something that looking at a crime, if you went to a crime scene, and I know how I interpret a crime scene. What do you see the crime scene? And look, I'll make it relevant, and let's talk the William Tyrrell matter.
Yep.
It's one that I'm aware of, and I know that you're aware of the circumstances surrounding that. That was where a child was abducted in a remote area. What it told me is that it wasn't someone there targeting William specifically. This is just the assumptions, the thought process going through my mind. It's someone that had a reason to be there, or at the extreme just happened to be there at a crucial time. Is that the type of thing as a criminologist that you can look at a crime scene and make determinations from there?
Yeah, and I actually went to the Tyrrell crime scene because I wrote about it for that book. And what struck me was, really, I thought that it probably was possibly purely situational. They saw him at the right time, but I think it's somebody who's seen William and knew him, because if you go there, and obviously you've been there many times, it's not the place where a child predator would go on the off chance of coming across a 3-year-old who just happens to be out of sight of their carers. Whereas if you compare that to where the Beaumont siblings disappeared in 1966, you could, going and standing there looking out over Glenelg Beach, you can see how a predator could stand there and look for victims, and you could be completely random in your choice, and you're going to find somebody there that you could, is situationally available to you as that kind of predator. Whereas I didn't get that sense when you go to the Tyrrell scene. So a different type of offender because the victim is in a different situation.
And look, from a detective's point of view, and it's interesting getting your insight into it as well, but that certainly stuck out to me. It's not someone that went there specifically looking for a child, like randomly to find the child, because you wouldn't expect to see a child in that area. And so little interpretations of a crime scene like that. Another case that I've worked on, and again, just getting your take on it and just checking how I look at things, the murder of Terry Falconer, when someone was abducted by people purporting to be police officers, then cut up in 7 bags and dumped in a river. Now, that told me about the type of offenders, and it's not... To me, it's not a first-time offence.
No, they've built up to that. Yeah,
and that's but saying that, and that gives you a line of inquiry. Like when I looked at that with the Terry Falconer one, I'm thinking, well, hold it, whoever's responsible for this, it's not their first time. And that's a fair interpretation of it. Yeah,
exactly. And as an anthropologist, you could look at those remains and you could look at the way the body was disarticulated, and that will tell you about how confident the offenders were in what they were doing. If they had anatomical knowledge, did they, it's not easy to chop a body up. So did they understand how the joints work? Because it can be easier to disarticulate in some ways. And I'm not going to give away any hints for anyone listening.
We don't
this is how you disarticulate a body more easily. But you can tell about what they know from the way the remains are presented.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people think when we're talking crime and talking the way that we approach investigations, they talk about, it's instinct, you've been a detective for a long time and you must go on your gut instinct and all that. But quite often when you break it down, it's nothing particularly special. It's experience and it's common sense.
You've seen it all before.
Yeah. If I see a victim whose face has been mutilated, it's personal. And it's fairly, you can look at it and think, okay, what's happened here? But if someone's face has been deliberately mutilated, I'm thinking, okay, it's someone they know or someone that's had a grudge against that person. Not all the time, and you've got to overlay your thoughts and theories with the cold hard facts. But it's interesting, and if I see someone, the way a body's been disposed of often tells me something about an investigation. What's your take on it if a body's just dumped in a local park? Obviously hasn't been murdered there, but dumped in a local park.
Yeah, so they've obviously not been treated with any kind of care or respect. I mean, you take that to the nth degree. If they're dumped at a rubbish tip, for example, that's totally disrespectful. Or have they been laid out and kind of cared for, or covered in some way that shows some level of, interaction and care for the remains. So certainly how they're, disposed of tells you a lot about how the offender felt about that person.
And that's what you can take from it. And I see from a detective's point of view, that's something that a line that I'll follow. But did you find in all looking at the crimes that you've done as a criminology, you started to develop that experience?
Yes, and I think that, the wound patterns are really interesting, how many they are, how frenzied they appear to be, tell you all about the offender. So that, again, it's that interaction between the victim and their offender and why the offender would perpetrate that type of abuse on that victim in the way that they did.
Yeah, you mentioned one. I won't mention the name because it was a particularly horrific crime, but a young lady that was killed, and there was a lot of stab wounds, but they weren't fatal stab wounds. And to me, that looked someone very sadistically torturing this person.
They want them to suffer.
Want them to suffer, don't want to kill them straight off. And so it was little nicks and cuts and that, but and stab wounds, but not deep stab wounds. And it's almost, to me, it told me of someone that's a coward and someone that's, wanted to drag this out, didn't want the end result. And
either personal or they want some information from that person. They've extended that torturous period for a reason.
Yeah. It is interesting what goes on in the minds of people that commit crime. Quite often I see with murder, and people think all murderers are bad people. But I've seen murders at crimes of passion and different things where it's a person can live a good life right up until this one moment, and they snap and someone dies. Have you seen cases along those lines?
Oh, certainly, especially when I did the first book. So I looked at all the different reasons why particularly mothers are accused of murdering their children. And, most of the time, these women who do intentionally harm their children, they don't have a good social network, they don't have any support, they may have mental health problems or substance abuse issues, and they snap, and that's not obviously always the case. Some of them are premeditated, but other times, you've obviously what's happened is awful, but you can look at that relationship between the mother and child and say, well, what chance did she have? She may have a really abusive background, and you just go, what chance was there for her to have a normal relationship with that child?
Yeah. Have you had dealings with infanticide, like the murder of a child in the first 12 months?
I've looked at cases. I haven't done any personally. Yeah. But when I was an undergrad, I did do a placement at Guy's and St Thomas's, and there was one of the pathologists specialised in child deaths, and we had a few that came through, and I got to sit in on those with the detectives. Yeah. So I was only kind of listening, but I've kind of experienced them from that investigative side as an undergrad, which was, quite eye-opening.
And so the book, the Mothers Who Murder, is there something that you see within those cases? Is something that jumps out?
Well, what I wanted to do with that book was look at when women are accused and they haven't done anything wrong. Right. So I started with Lindy Chamberlain Creighton, because I wanted people to read the cases with an open mind, because again, it comes back to that no smoke without fire. And people will still ask me if I think she's guilty, and I'm like, really? Yeah. Have we not moved on? What more information can you possibly need to know that she had nothing to do with Azaria's death? So I wanted to start there so that people read each case. And I don't want to tell people with the books what to think. Yep. I want them to make up their own mind.
Okay.
And, they could be a jury member one day, and I want them to be open-minded. So I looked at a number of cases, some where we know that the mother was guilty, but others where there are genuine question marks. But you've got to be quite brave to raise some of those because, when these women are potentially still in prison, like Kelly Lane and Kathleen Forbig, to actually say, I think there could be problems with the evidence here. It takes a little bit of... you've got to
especially
step up.
when the kids have been murdered and people's emotions.
Very emotive. People generally kind of vilify these women. Yeah. So it can be an emotional or psychological challenge for some people to accept that they may not in fact be guilty. But somebody's got to be willing to stand up and ask those questions.
I know when I've done murder investigations where women have killed children or young children or did one foster child, people do have strong opinions about it, and I also find it difficult sometimes to get people convicted, a mother convicted, and this is just an alternate view on what you're saying, mothers convicted of murdering their child because people in the jury go, our mother couldn't do that.
Yes.
And so
they're a nurturer.
Yeah, and I've seen results where the charge has been murder and it's gone to manslaughter, even though I think in these particular occasions the evidence would be supportive of the fact that it was murder because of the nature of the injuries. But I think people feel more comfortable saying, well, a mother wouldn't do that. But the same regards, once they accept in their own mind that the mother's guilty, then they're hung out to dry
exactly.
because they're a child killer.
Because, they are meant to be that nurturer. Everyone, women are meant to love children and, and so when, as you say, they accept that mother has intentionally harmed her own child when there is no punishment that is, severe enough. Whereas when a father does it, it's like, well, men get violent sometimes. You go, whoa.
Yeah, well, that's quite often the case that they look at. Well, a woman wouldn't do it, but a man. And I can honestly say, in my time, I've seen some very violent and nasty women.
Oh, for sure.
But they present for all intents and purposes as you would expect a middle-aged woman to present, or whatever, and then scratch the surface, and there's something nasty there that would scare most people. Another thing that you've been involved in, make sure I pronounce this properly because I always get it wrong, and now I put pressure on myself, I definitely will.
I'll put you right, don't worry.
Taphonomy.
Well, kind of close. Close.
Okay. The farm out there. I refer to it as a body farm. That's
and most people do colloquially.
That's probably a bit dramatic, but do you want to tell me what that's about?
Yeah, well,
I think people
taphonomic.
Isn't that what I said?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. Okay.
So basically, it's a research facility where human remains are left generally either on the surface or buried to look at decomposition. So that's what taphonomic means.
Right.
Colloquially known as a body farm after the book named The Body Farm, which was the Tennessee facility. People who work at these facilities tend not to call them that because farm has an association with animals, and it seems disrespectful to the donors because all of the remains that we research are bequeathed through donation programs, just as you would for medical research. So we tend not to call them that, but when you say a research, taphonomy facility, everyone goes, "A what?" And so you say a body farm, and they go, "Gotcha, know what that is."
Okay.
So we look at decomposition rates, and last year we actually watched a donor decompose from fresh. So they were laid out, and within 2 hours we'd set up a number of stills cameras and watched the entire process for 18 months.
Right.
And so that was, I think, the first time in Australia that's actually been mapped from beginning to basically not fully skeletonized, because we found that actually the individuals at this particular facility tend to mummify. There's something about the environment, but we actually have that whole process. And one of the fascinating things that we discovered is that the body actually moves quite a lot, more so than you would think. And that's to do with the soft tissues as they contract and decompose. And actually the arms move quite a considerable amount. I think you'd be particularly interested in that. So that was something we actually captured.
Yeah. And what's the purpose of the research?
Well, the purpose is to look at improving our understanding of how long somebody has been deceased in an Australian environment. All the data we use to predict time since death comes mostly from the US. So they have a number of facilities in the US. And then we kind of say, well, if the body is presenting in this way, then can we kind of step back to determine how long that person has probably been in this environment? But using US data is not ideal because it's not the same, obviously, as an Australian environment. So this was the first time that we've looked at how that happens in Australia, and really capturing as much data as we possibly can around that to assist the police when a remains present. So we know how long this person's been deceased. So who should we be looking at in terms of missing persons?
And I think that from a police point of view, to understand the importance of that, when you're investigating a crime, and we've come across, invariably we start with a body's been found somewhere. That's quite often how a homicide investigation commences. The thing that we need right from the start is, when did this occur?
Yeah, when did they die?
When did they die? And if it's skeletal remains, it tells you it's been there for a while. But when a body's decomposed, or when maggots are on the body, or the type of decomposition, if we can get that as exactly as possible, it gives us a big help when we're investigating crime. So.
Exactly. So within the first few hours, the pathologist is great for giving you a time since death. But outside of that window, when that decomposition starts, it's really understanding exactly what stage all of those different elements are at. You know, what insects are on the remains, because they have different preferences too. And, you know, what changes have we seen? How can we map that? Okay, what's the best guess we can give you how long this person's been deceased?
And it's once we've got that time frame from an investigative point of view, that helps us a great deal. So with your study with criminology, victimology, do you look at that? Who are the victims in certain types of crime?
For sure, and especially, I guess, in the cold case book, that was really important because the type of victim tells you everything about the offender. So I mentioned the Beaumont siblings earlier. Well, I think that was probably a random situational attack, but obviously they were chosen because they were children, they were vulnerable, they didn't have an adult with them. So learning about the victim can tell you so much about your offender. Same with Mr. Cruel as well. All children, you know, but he'd obviously, slightly different scenario, he'd obviously watched those children and chosen them intentionally. And from the use of space, the way he, you know, where he attacked the children to where he left the children, that tells you about how he moved in that environment. So the victims are everything when trying to understand the crime.
Because people often ask how we commence a homicide investigation. Obviously the crime scene, we look at the crime scene and gather what evidence we can there. But then I'm a big believer, and this is standard homicide practice. We look at the victim, and I call it victimology. And the fact is that if you look at the victim, quite often that will lead you to the offender. What type of lifestyle was the victim involved in? Who were they associating with? And it's so important. So that research farm, just jumping back to that, so the body farm, or I'll try and pronounce it again, Taphonomy.
Hey,
there you go.
Well done.
Experimental Research Centre. Did you do any work with Shari Forbes?
Yeah, I know Shari quite well.
Yes.
So Shari obviously established that facility. And so the one on the outskirts of Sydney is the first one outside of the US. And so I was actually part of the original group that helped establish that facility back in, might be 2015 even now. It's a while ago.
I think that would have been
maybe tail end of 2015. And obviously Shari is now off in Canada, and she's opening the first facility over there. So I've had an invitation over there, and I will not be going in the winter. I'm telling you that. So it'd be great to do some joint research with Shari over there now, and I've got good connections with the US facilities too. And one of my PhDs is actually going to be going to the US to collect comparative data to match to our data here.
Well, from a crime fighting perspective, all that science helps so much. And I know with Shari, how I know her through was during our search for Matthew Levison's remains. And we sought some advice from Shari, but it's an interesting field. Also, human craniofacial biometrics is something else that you do.
Yeah, so that was what I focused on for my PhD. So we actually photographed about 3,000 people, and we had 8 different digital cameras, and we actually built those into 3D models of each face. And then each face was landmarked with about 30 different landmarks. So the corners of your eyes, tip of your nose, corners of the mouth, to develop what we were hoping would be the average face to improve our methods of CCTV. Now, this is going back quite a while. So recognition from CCTV didn't used to be that great. It's much better now. But we were trying to improve that. And that was actually part funded by the FBI. So I got to go to Quantico, which was awesome.
Well, you can tell me about that, surely.
And have the FBI sit around one of their conference tables, and I got to lecture them about our research.
Wow.
And I know, and they had to all listen to me as a little PhD student. So that was great.
That's pretty impressive.
It was.
And is that the type of skill set that with CCTV, where they talk about identification at airports and that you can identify people from those
similar
points of identification?
Yeah, a lot of it has obviously been computerized now. So this was quite a long time ago. But it's all about different points on the face and comparing them. We tried to develop an average face, but we quickly learned that there isn't really an average face. But I mean, there's still a long way to go because you get a lot of false negatives and a lot of false positives with facial recognition. But we are kind of making strides, and it's incredibly important with terrorism, etc. People on crowd, moving through, mass scenarios, airports, all these large crowds, having to check them quickly. Yeah,
and it also assists with children that have disappeared. And again, I reference William. That it's now 6 years. So how William would look from a 3-year-old to a 9-year-old.
Yeah, so last year I actually arranged to have a facial progression done of William.
Yep.
So the child's face will change a lot between the ages of 3 and 8, and that's really because you get your adult teeth coming through. So as a 3-year-old, some of them would have been developing in your jaws, but they wouldn't have been actually in the final adult position, whereas by 8, you're getting some of those adult teeth through. So the lower jaw, particularly in children, has developed a lot over that period because the teeth are bigger, so the jaw has to be bigger to accommodate. Yeah. So a child's face changes from that really kind of elfin, small face of a 3-year-old to an 8-year-old, and then it continues to grow. So it's a good time to do an age progression. So you take images of what William looked like at 3, any images that are available for siblings, parents, especially at the same kind of age that you want to progress to.
Right.
And then a forensic artist will actually take those and do a best guess based on what they understand about the anatomy and how somebody changes over time to give you an image of what that child could look like now, because people are still looking for 3-year-old William. And clearly William is not 3 anymore.
And that from an investigative point of view, that was something that we had to encounter even years down the track, where people were phoning up and saying they've seen someone that looked like William, where they hadn't really accepted the fact that William...
A little boy in a Spider-Man suit who's 3 years old, and you go, well...
Well, we actually had calls from people saying they saw a kid in a Spider-Man suit 2 years after, but that's, we encourage the assistance from the public, so it's a sort of double-edged sword, I suppose. Sometimes we get inundated with things. DNA evidence, in your understanding of where we're at with DNA in terms of crime and investigating crime. I know from a detective's point of view it's such a significant breakthrough, and I think the first time that I was involved in a DNA case was a murder of Eileen Cantlay, which was, I think, 1991.
That was early then for DNA.
Very early. And that we had a suspect that was it was a particularly brutal crime. Eileen was in her 80s and her house was broken into and she was sexually assaulted and murdered. We got DNA sample from semen at the crime scene, and we had a suspect, and for a very good reason. And you talk about wrongful convictions. This bloke presented himself in every possible way as someone that was responsible for the crime. But when we gathered his DNA and it was shown that it wasn't his DNA, it was very confusing for us as police officers at the time. What is this science that's telling us all our instincts and everything's telling us it's this person? But just from a test in the laboratory, we've been told, no, it's not. That wasn't his semen at the scene. But then we found another suspect and matched it, and then it came back and we were told this is, and the percentages, and you need to be a mathematician, but 1 in 6 billion chance of it being anything other than this person's. It was a game changer from an investigative point of view, because normally we'd just rely on fingerprints and whatnot. But it was it was strange to think that we were going to charge a person based on this. He ended up confessing to the crimes, but I think the fact that we had his DNA and were so confident when we went into the interview room, it made it easier. What's your thoughts with DNA and where it's going to head in the future?
Well, it's a whole new world, wasn't it? So, I guess back then you couldn't have imagined where we would be today.
No.
And we're still making huge strides with DNA. So not only are we much better now at being able to analyse very small samples, we can also repair degraded samples or damaged samples, and we can also separate samples. So you may have a mixed DNA sample where you have contributions from more than one person, and you can now separate those and still get a full profile for each. But great strides even more recently than that with phenotyping, so creating a facial likeness from just a buccal swab, a cheek swab.
Do you want to explain this, because this is scary future science stuff?
It is a little scary, and I've actually had mine done. I'll show you when we're done.
Okay.
And basically you can take any sample of DNA, so it could be from human remains, it could be from a suspect sample from a scene, it could be so I've had mine done from a buccal swab, the little sample. They just scrape your cheek and they can create your facial likeness from that. And basically it's not a photograph of what you look like, it's a prediction of what your DNA suggests you should look like based on thousands of DNA samples compared to thousands and thousands of images. So the pair are analysed, an interpretation of exactly what each bit of DNA says about the way you look. So that could be your eye colour, your hair color, how many freckles you have, your nose shape, everything, your ear placement. And this creates a statistical likelihood of what your DNA says, your genotype says you look like, which is your phenotype. So your genes are what you are, and your phenotype is what you look like. And so we can now use that to predict, what a person of interest may look like from a blood sample at a scene. You may have no witnesses, no CCTV, nothing else, and we can still create a facial likeness of that person that the police are looking for.
So this is futuristic, scary stuff, isn't it?
Well,
I'd see benefits. I want to come back and be a detective again.
It could be scary if you're a bad guy. It's a scary thing. But also it can be used in long-term deceased cases to create a facial likeness that's more accurate than possibly some of the artistic impressions from a skull. Or if you have, for example, a torso and you don't know what the person looked like, you can create a facial likeness to put out to the public to hopefully get an identification if they haven't, DNA hasn't come up on a database or whatever.
So we could have a crime scene where an offender's left his DNA or her DNA in whatever, whether it's just by touching the surface, blood or whatever. And what you're saying here is that from that you can, not perfect at this stage, but you can extract from that who that person may be.
Yes, and also because it looks at your ancestry. So we could tell you whether you're looking at somebody with a, Eastern European ancestry or certain parts of the US or an islander. So different parts of the world have different proportions of DNA. So you can actually say this person's ancestry is from this part of the world. So it can prevent the police going off and questioning the wrong population group. And I've seen that, for example, when, there's cases where, you may be looking within an immigrant population because some witnesses said that, that's who they saw running from a murder scene, and it comes back as a, Eastern European.
Right.
And so you go, let's leave that population alone and start focusing on the population that we know the DNA belongs to.
They're good tools, aren't they?
Yeah.
Can you see, I've always had a concern with DNA because when, if we're managing a crime scene about contamination with DNA is, I shook your hand when I met you today. There's a chance that our DNA
you're a shedder, yeah.
Yeah, been passed.
Yep.
And is the science becoming so good? Can you see where it's going to become problematic?
It's already happened.
Every one of us in this room at the moment might exchange DNA, might be contaminated.
Yeah, and it's already happened. So, when you shake somebody's hand now, if you were a shedder, so that's somebody who preferentially loses skin cells.
Yep.
Therefore, I could be carrying a higher proportion of your skin cells on my hand. Now, if I went and killed somebody, if I touched a weapon and killed somebody, your DNA could be on that weapon.
Right.
Now, you're going to then have to explain to the police how your DNA is on it.
Yeah.
And that can be problematic because we can look at such tiny amounts and we don't really understand how DNA is transferred, not to the level, where we can really explain somebody's contact with something that, I can certainly see that that's going to be a problem.
And because it is getting before, and I know from my time with the Barraville murder investigations of the 3 Aboriginal children, there was some DNA that was found at one scene there, but to test it, it was lost. We destroyed it because that was the late or early 90s, and it was destroyed. But now it's just minuscule, the amount of DNA.
So 1 nanogram, which is a tiny, tiny amount.
Yeah.
And often I've heard, some really great investigators have actually waited and waited and waited, until they're basically hopeful that the analysis is up to the point where they're going to get a result. And it's just that cutting edge, isn't it? It's like, when do we go?
Yeah.
Is it too early? Are we going to lose it? Is it going to answer our question? And it's just, you've got to balance that up in the investigation.
It's difficult, but that contamination aspect of it, and that's why preservation of crime scene is so important. And I think we're awake to it in this day and age, but it's not unusual for a detective to go to the murder scene and then go to the suspect and get in the back of the police car with the suspect, then sit in the interview room, and you can see how
transfer happens.
Transfers could happen. So
sure.
I think that's something that really we've got to be aware of. And as much as science is there, I always feel comfortable. And sometimes I've gone with the DNA, but I always feel comfortable when you've got evidence that supports
I think there should always be two sets of evidence. So even if you've got fingerprints, DNA, whatever it is, I don't think anyone should ever be found guilty on the basis of one evidence type alone. I think there always has to be something to corroborate. That could be eyewitnesses, it could be something circumstantial. It doesn't matter what it is, but there's got to be corroboration, because it's just too risky when there's only one evidence type. You know, especially when we're talking murder, the most serious crime there is, there has to be something else.
And we've got the National Criminal Investigation DNA database too. Do you want to explain how that works?
Yeah, so this is samples are uploaded to the database, but possibly not as many or as routinely as we would like. And obviously, we've just found out that we're going to have a national DNA database where it's going to be a lot more efficient across all of the states and territories. And the purpose of this is to make sure that more crimes are getting solved, more crimes are getting linked, but also identifying unknown deceased. So actually a good friend of mine is heading this up, Dr. Jodie Ward, and she's been pushing for this national database for about 5 years now. And so we're going to see a lot more of those DNA and all of that information being married up in an efficient way. And you would think that was possible across Australia. We've only got 8 states and territories.
Well, we can't even cross borders these days.
Well, no, not at the moment. Fingers crossed soon. So we're going to have that national facility to help solve some of these long-term crimes. And I think we're going to see massive results when that happens. Great results.
I think so too. And taking samples from prisoners,
yes,
DNA samples from
that
prisoners.
Hasn't happened routinely, which is
I know. It's I think society would accept you forgo your right to protect your DNA when you're being sentenced.
And family members too. So when I was looking at the Beaumont case a few years ago, I said to the detective, I was like, please tell me you've got the parents' DNA because, they're in their 90s now. And so if the children are ever found alive or deceased, then you need the parents' DNA to confirm the identity. And so once they're gone, they're gone.
Yeah, there was one case you made reference to in your book that was the Rita Knight matter, a 91-year-old lady that was attacked and sexually assaulted in Wee Waa. It was in the early 90s. I remember my partner at the time, Jason Evers, worked on the case, and they went up there and bulk tested because it was a small country town, so it lent itself perfectly to it. And I think the process was that the police said, okay, well, there's 500 males in the township between the ages that they'd narrowed it down to. We want volunteers for DNA. So they did bulk DNA testing, and from that they, I think, 470 males agreed to do it out of 500.
And the other 30, now why would they not agree to their DNA being tested? That's the question, isn't it?
It's not rocket science, but you'd be looking for your suspects. But the suspect was caught from that. And I think, I do understand civil liberties and that, but I think it's just an interesting way of approaching crime, like getting the community support and going, okay, let's put the pressure on, and it certainly answers the question on, why wouldn't you want to provide your DNA?
And am I right in thinking that was the first time that mass sampling was used in Australia?
I
certainly
think it
one
was.
of them.
Yeah, I know it was fairly innovative. Paul Mager was the inspector who was my inspector. He was up there at the time, and I remember when he was saying about it, I loved the idea. I thought it was a really great way of approaching it.
And we had one in the UK as well where he did a mass screening, and the individual actually basically paid his mate to give his DNA instead, and then was bragging about it in the pub and was overheard, and that's how he was caught. We never said they were smart, did we, Gary? No. So, it worked,
Yeah. Well, there was, with this particular one too, there was a survey that was put out with the people that volunteered on what punishment they think that if the person's caught should be got, and you could imagine the response in a country town: he should be hung, he should be this, should be that.
Yeah, 91-year-old woman.
Yeah, and but there was one response that perhaps this person just made a mistake and forgiveness.
And how many alarm bells go off at that point?
Guess who was the offender?
As I said, not smart, but
Yeah. But look, they're all tools. They're all tools that can be used, and it's certainly, I think, swinging the position of in favour of the prosecution rather than the defence. But also with the DNA and over in America, I know they make a big deal out of it, how many people have come off death row because of DNA results. And that's scary, isn't it?
It is, especially as post-conviction DNA testing, you actually have no right to that. So if your DNA was available at the time and maybe wasn't tested and you were still convicted, then afterwards, you don't have a right to insist that your DNA is actually compared to that from the crime scene. But we're hearing about convictions all the time being overturned on the basis of DNA.
Yeah.
So it is a powerful tool for the defence, but it's not always easy for the defence to get that utilised. They need permission to get it tested.
Yeah. You've also, in your spare time between books and TV, you've...
And eating yoghurt. Yeah.
and yogurt, yes.
Love my yoghurt.
You've written some articles, and some of the topics of the articles you've written I've found particularly interesting. And women can be psychopaths too, in ways that are more subtle but just as dangerous. So you wrote an article about that. That interests me, and I think it interests every person. On what is a psychopath? First of all, how would you describe a psychopath?
So a psychopath is somebody who's born without the ability to feel love, empathy, sympathy, remorse. They're incredibly self-centered. They are quite often narcissistic, and everything in their world is about them. So what they can get for something. So they tend to see people as either somebody they can use and manipulate for their own gain, or somebody to get out of the way. And they also see people as prey. So when that is matched with violent tendencies, you get the Ted Bundys of the world, the Ivan Malats of the world. They are the worst of the worst because they don't believe in the same social cues and, restrictions that everyone else does. It's all about what they want and satisfying whatever their need is. And I became particularly interested in women because I think I have a female psychopath in my family, actually.
Oh, right.
Quite close. Yeah, and there is a genetic
don't
predisposition. No, I won't. And so I was interested in their behaviour.
Yeah.
And trying to understand why they did the things they did. And that's kind of how that article came about. And also when you look at some female offenders, the Black Widows, they may not be the ones going out stabbing their partners, but they may poison them, or they may manipulate other men into killing them. So they're incredibly manipulative, and they can be very charming and charismatic to control other people to get what they want. So that's why I wrote that. I was like, female psychopaths, I know one.
Right. And in terms of psychopaths, with your studies in criminology, is there as many female psychopaths as there are males?
That's a great question. We think that there are probably less, but really they're probably less easily identified because they don't necessarily present in the same way males do. And we've done quite a lot of work on males, including looking at brain scans. So there's been a number of studies that have actually shown men what would be to everyone else disturbing images mixed in with non-disturbing. And you can actually look at the parts of the brain that are activated during those scans. And individuals who are psychopathic don't feel the same level of trauma, psychological trauma, when looking at traumatic images that the average person would. So there's been a lot of studies looking at that, and obviously the most violent predatory individuals are male psychopaths. And so I just don't think we're as good at identifying women, but you probably know them. They're the ones who love causing trouble. They're very manipulative psychologically, emotionally. They often play the victim. They live parasitically off other people. They don't necessarily feel that they have to contribute anything. It's all about me. And I bet you know one, at least one.
I think, and in your article, you identified people that the public might know from a fictional point of view, and the Glenn Close, the Bunny Boiler in that Fatal Attraction movie.
Yeah, she was certainly disturbed.
And I think that's that sort of people. Okay, that's out there. And what was the other one? Misery with.
There's also it's the more subtle ones I think that are dangerous though, that are really kind of undermining relationships. They're the gaslighters. They're the ones who are really controlling and manipulating other people. So they're actually sliding beneath that radar, but they're causing just as much psychological and emotional trauma. We're just not, we're not recognising them for what they are.
Well, it's easier to identify the bad guy, the nasty male psychopath. But females potentially can, or the indicators aren't as strong to us when we're looking at it, or more disguised. But I always found if I'm dealing with someone that I consider a psychopath, that they were very difficult to find which button to push in an interview. Like you can't shame them into anything. You're not going to embarrass them. You're not going to scare them. And you're getting this response back, and you're thinking this is not. You
have to find the little trigger, don't you?
Yeah. And I think you said narcissistic. I try to push the ego button with them. Sometimes I found that's worked. What do you, because quite often people say psychopath or sociopath. What's the difference between the two?
Well, some people would say there isn't a difference, but current understanding is that a psychopath is born the way they are. The brain is wired the way it is. So it's not that they are created. They are basically, nature has, define their brain and the structures of the brain the way it is. So that you can never treat them because you're not going to change the actual physical structure, anatomical structure of the brain. Whereas a sociopath is somebody who's probably born with some of the tendencies, but if they have a stable, loving upbringing, you can reduce some of the outcomes. And a sociopath can form strong bonds with a limited number of individuals, whereas a psychopath can't really. They can mimic it, but they never actually form emotional bonds because they just don't feel it. Right. So basically a psychopath is born and a sociopath is made, is the current understanding.
Is again, and it's a general question, but psychopaths, are they always potentially dangerous? Or can they live a productive life and go through if you put them in the right environment? Because I've heard it said sometimes, whether it's military, police, or different environments, even leaders in certain areas can display traits of a psychopath, but they're successful because it's the area that they're in channels that energy.
Yeah, and we actually call them successful psychopaths. So they may be business leaders, they may be surgeons, pilots. They basically sometimes have that God complex. They can do anything.
Presidents of large companies.
Well, people always say that. Isn't a psychopath? And go, well, I would think so probably, to be honest, because they have total belief in what they are and who they are. And part of the ego means that when you challenge them, you question them, they don't take that very well. That narcissist really comes out. How dare you challenge me? Don't you know who I am? I'm the greatest at everything. They can be very successful because they can be great business leaders. Or as I said, surgeons. You want a surgeon who thinks he's God if he's about to operate on you. Yeah. Well, or a pilot who can land the plane.
Or make risky decisions, and in some environments, risky decisions will be rewarded and recognised.
And they're not held back by implications for people. So if they're a businessman and they may need to, close that business because it's not successful, they're not going to care about all the people they're going to make redundant, if it's a good decision. And sometimes, countries need those individuals who make tough choices. Yeah.
And it's interesting you say that they don't display any empathy, because that's often when I'm sitting in the interview room with someone, you can see it, that they got the shits because they've been caught, but they couldn't care less about the victim when it's all said and done, or the victim's family or anything like that. And you can throw all the emotional stuff at them, but they don't care.
No, they might be able to mimic it, but they're probably thinking they can outsmart you.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Another topic, glamorising violent offenders. But before we go there, what do you think the attraction is to true crime?
Oh, people ask me that all the time, and I think it's because it's the extremes of what people will do. And I think women are particularly interested in it because they are interested in relationships. Like the vast number of my students are females. Yeah. They want to understand why people do the things they do and why people are victimised. So I think it's partly that. I think it's partly people are puzzles, figuring stuff out. And then maybe a little touch of, I'm glad that wasn't me. When you watch something and it's, about a horrible crime, you go, well, that didn't happen to me. So you kind of feel safe in your own little bubble. So I think it's different for different people.
Okay. But it's certainly something that, people, it seems insatiable at the moment.
That's the podcasts.
Yeah, well, I know. It's crazy. People are so interested in it. Your article also touched on glamorising violent offenders. And I think this is an important thing too, because I've always had a thought where there's a mass killing or whatever, Julian Knight, let's say, or one of those. I would like their names not even mentioned. And I know over in New Zealand, the Prime Minister made a point of not mentioning the offender's name over there for the
mosque bombings
and the shooting. Over there. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, this is something that I became aware of, especially dealing with my students at Newcastle Uni. So if you put up pictures of the Mallett victims, for example, they won't know who they are. Yeah. But then you put up a picture of Ivan Mallett and everyone knows him. And I think that's offensive. They've all been homogenised into this Mallett's victims. So they've all lost their names and their identities and their histories. Yeah. And, they're not even really people anymore. They're just, somebody he's offended against. And I think that we need to stop really focusing on the violent offenders and start remembering that each of these victims was a person, has a story, has a family. So we stop really focusing on those victims, those offenders, and really start talking about the victim stories.
I think that's a great idea, and I've thought that for a long time, that we put, and these nutters, psychopaths, whatever you want to call them, but people want to, they think they're going to be legends because they've committed these horrendous crimes, and we feed into it when we publicise their names and they become infamous. And I can see some benefits.
It's like when Mallett died, I did a few interviews around that because I'd obviously written about him. I was like, I'd really like it if we could stop talking about him now. The only time we should mention him now is if we're looking at some of the other potential victims. Yeah. Can we help some of the other victims who I have no doubt there are others that he killed or harmed? And so if we ever talk about him again, let's try and help them. Otherwise,
focus on the victim.
Yeah, rather than let's just forget him and let's try and solve some of those unsolved.
It makes sense because you see sometimes, and the gangsters that get glamorised in TV series or movies or that type of thing. You don't want them to be the heroes.
Yeah.
The other article, women who sexually abuse children, but their reasons are different to men. And I read that article and I found that quite interesting because I hadn't really considered that perspective. That I was thinking that the women that I've been involved in as offenders that have sexually abused children, I didn't look at the difference between the reasons. Do you want to talk to us on that?
Yeah, well, I guess I noticed that when I was again back in Scotland looking at a case of alleged child sexual abuse. There was one that we did that was focused around a childcare facility, and one of the women there was taking indecent images of children and she was actually selling them online. So she wasn't sexually interested in the children, but she was interested in making money out of it.
So her motivation was financial.
Purely financial, and she's obviously selling those to men. Yeah. So that was interesting to me that she was willing to do that for financial gain and didn't have any sympathy with any of her victims. It was just a monetary transaction.
if you looked at that without delving in deep, you'd just go, oh, she's interested in child porn.
But no, she had no interest in sexually in the children at all. So that was, I guess, where I started thinking about it. And the more cases we did a number where images were recovered from men's phones and they maybe had an adult female partner and the partner was like, that's not a child, that's me. Because obviously seeing parts of the anatomy. And then we had to do a whole report on how adult women and children do not look the same anatomically post-puberty. But these women who may have known nothing about the offence were willing to step up and protect their male partners. And that was quite a surprise to me because I imagine if I was ever in that situation, I would be having a different response to that.
Yeah.
And so the more cases that I came across where women were offending against children, most often when they were actually sexually interested, the children tend to be older and they were almost a replacement for an adult male. So you see these cases where women in their 20s and 30s may be offending against schoolboys, 12, 13, 14. And if you look at their histories, they may have failed relationships with men. And so the boy is a replacement for the adult man, but he's easier to control than a man.
Right.
So the woman is using him as a proxy for an adult relationship.
Right. No, it's interesting dividing up between the male and female and what motivates them in those type of offences. I think now's probably a good time. We might have our break and recharge our drinks. I've found it very interesting, like the whole the crime side of things. Like we can talk for hours on your skill set and how that helps with investigations. Where we're going to go to in part 2, we're going to take a lot from your book, Reasonable Doubt, because I think that's particularly interesting. I know you're passionate about it where people have been wrongfully convicted or where there's been failures within the judicial system. And I promise I won't raise my own case.
That's for later, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Can we talk about that?
Yeah, we can.
I've recently been convicted.
Yeah, have you?
Yes. Yeah. You shouldn't be laughing. It's not funny. Okay. All right, we'll have a break. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
This podcast series is brought to you by True Crime Australia. Visit eyecatchkillers.com.au for additional material such as articles on what you heard, videos and galleries. You can search for the Eye Catch Killers with Gary Jubilant official group on Facebook and join in with discussion. See you for the next episode of the podcast.